Winter arrived before the Germans could win. Moscow resisted, not by miracle but at a human cost. When the Wehrmacht failed to take the Soviet capital, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But the war did not take a step back. The German columns began to retreat, creaking over frozen roads, engines sputtering and exhausted men clinging to ice-covered trucks. But this was no flight. It was a calculated, cold, disciplined retreat. They hadn't abandoned everything. They chose where to stop, and they stopped at Rzhev. There, amidst dark forests, wooden villages and frozen rivers, the Germans sank their teeth into the Russian soil. Trenches sprang up quickly. Machine gun nests were buried in the snow. Barbed wire was stretched like invisible traps beneath the white of winter. In a few days, a massive enclosure was formed. German Salient, a bulge of enemy troops advancing dangerously towards Moscow. Just 150 kilometers, they separated Rzhev from the Kremlin. To someone looking at a map, this might seem like little. To Stalin, it was terrifying. This wasn't just occupied territory, it was a living threat. A clenched fist, ready to strike the Soviet capital again as soon as winter subsided. In the Kremlin, maps were opened day and night. Red lines marked German positions. Each line looked like a blade. Stalin understood something essential. As long as Rzhev remained in the hands of the Wehrmacht, Moscow would never be safe. And the soldiers knew it. On the German side, starving. And frozen men gripped their weapons with numb fingers, knowing they were too far ahead, but also knowing that they could not back down any further. Behind them lay no glory, only the path to defeat. Ahead lay the enemy, the cold, and the certainty that this land would be defended to the last bullet. On the Soviet side, young soldiers newly arrived from Siberia observed that protrusion as if it were a sleeping monster. They didn't know it yet, but they were looking at what would become one of the bloodiest killing fields of the war. Rzhev did not explode. Rzhev, I expected. And while the winter of 1941 buried bodies under the snow, that ghost remained there. Silent, motionless, pointed directly at the heart of the Soviet Union. The meat grinder hadn't started yet, but the engine was already running. Rzhev was not an important city before the war. It didn't have the glamour of Moscow, nor the symbolism of Leningrad. But in that endless winter, it transformed into something far worse. Place where men entered and rarely left unscathed. The German salient grew like an open wound on the map. Narrow roads cut through dense forests where sunlight barely touched the ground. Among the trees, snow concealed mines, frozen corpses, and abandoned weapons. At night, the wind rustled through the branches like a constant lament, mingled with the distant crackle of artillery. The Germans dug deep. They learned from their failure against Moscow. Each village was transformed into a small fortress. Wooden houses became makeshift bunkers. Basements became firing positions. Churches, once places of prayer, now served as observation posts for mortars and snipers. Nothing was left to chance. The defensive positions overlapped. If one trench fell, another would take over the fire. If a village was captured, the Germans would retreat a few meters and fight again. Every meter of land cost blood. For the Red Army, it was a nightmare. There was no room for elegant maneuvers. There were no open flanks. There was only forehead, and the front was spitting fire. Soviet soldiers advanced in long columns, often without accurate maps. Officers shouted orders as snow fell on the men's faces. When the attack began, the silence of the forest was shattered by the dry sound of German machine guns. Men fell before they even saw the enemy. The snow, white just minutes before, was quickly stained dark red. The wounded tried to crawl, leaving trails of blood that froze almost immediately. Many screamed for help. Others simply stood still, staring at the grey sky, waiting for the cold to finish its work. And the cold was relentless. Weapons jammed, boots froze. Soldiers slept huddled together to avoid dying during the night. Some didn't wake up. In the morning, their bodies were stiff, covered in a thin layer of ice, like forgotten statues. Nevertheless, Moscow demanded results. For Stalin, that promontory was a constant humiliation. An enemy there meant eternal danger. No matter the cost, Rzhev needed to be destroyed. The problem is that nobody yet understood the real price that decision would demand. Rzhev was not just a defensive position, it was a trap. And the more the Red Army attacked, the deeper it penetrated. The meat grinder began to turn, slowly, creaking, hungry. In early 1942, snow still dominated everything. The cold was relentless. And yet, in the heated rooms of the Kremlin, decisions were made as if winter did not exist. Stalin was convinced of one thing. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. If it were pressed hard enough, it would break. The plan was simple, cruelly simple. Attack Rzhev head-on, not just once, but repeatedly. Entire divisions of the Red Army were hastily assembled. Many soldiers had only a few weeks of training. Some barely knew how to use a rifle properly. Others had never fired a live round. Yet they received clear orders: advance. The logic of the Soviet command wasn't elegant, but it seemed logical on paper. The Germans were far from their bases with limited supplies. If they were attacked relentlessly, day after day, they would eventually bleed to pieces until they could no longer resist. The problem was that the Germans weren't broke. They were buried. When the attack began, the Soviet artillery roared first. Cannons fired relentlessly, shaking the frozen ground. Trees were uprooted. Entire villages disappeared in clouds of smoke and snow. For a few minutes, it seemed that nothing could survive it. But when the infantry advanced, reality set in. German machine guns, silent until then, suddenly awoke. The sound was continuous, almost mechanical. Entire rows of Soviet soldiers fell before taking 10 steps. Officers shouted for them to keep going. The men obeyed, not out of heroism, but because stopping meant dying anyway. Bodies piled up in the open fields. Some soldiers used the corpses of their own comrades as makeshift cover. Others slipped on blood mixed with snow. The advance turned into a desperate struggle just to reach the next meter of land alive. And even when they managed to reach the German trenches, the fighting didn't end. Something even worse began. Grenades exploded in enclosed spaces. Bayonets silently entered and exited bodies. Men fought hand to hand, slipping on the ice, shouting in different languages, but dying all the same. The losses were enormous. Optimistic reports were pouring into Moscow. Phrases like limited progress and strong enemy resistance concealed the truth. The Red Army was being ground up. Still, new orders kept arriving. New units were advancing. New attacks were launched. Rzhev did not fall. Each offensive left the field more crowded with bodies, harder to cross, more macabre. The snow was no longer white. It was grey, brown, red, and beneath it, frozen men marked where others would fall later. The Soviet plan was underway, but nobody was calling it by its proper name yet. That wasn't an offensive. It was a mass sacrifice, and Rzhev, silent and motionless, remained there, devouring everything that came its way. The winter of 1942 was not just cold, he was cruel. The temperature dropped so low that breath turned to crystals in the air. Beards froze, weapons stuck to bare hands. Wounded people who weren't removed within minutes simply died. They did not survive. Even so, the orders were clear. Attack Rzhev again and again and again. Before dawn, Soviet soldiers lined up in the forests. Many trembled, not only from the cold, but from fear. Some knew what awaited them. Others still believed that this attack would be different. There was always that short-lived, fragile hope. When the whistle blew, they would emerge from the trees and advance across the open fields. That's when all hell broke loose. German machine guns swept across the terrain in fans of fire. The sound didn't come in isolated bursts, but in a continuous roar, as if the earth itself was spitting bullets. Men were hit in the chest, face, and legs. Many didn't even scream. They simply fell, knocked down by the force of the impact. Those who came behind stumbled over the bodies. They fell. They got up. They fell again. The snow absorbed the blood quickly, forming dark stains that spread like shadows. Some soldiers tried to crawl backward, leaving red furrows in the frozen ground. Others lay motionless, their eyes open, lifeless, as the battle raged above them, and she always passed by. The attacks lasted for hours. When they finally stopped, the countryside fell silent for a few minutes. A heavy silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant crackling of fires in destroyed villages. Then night fell. The darkness brought another kind of terror. Rescue teams tried to find survivors, but many of the wounded were already freezing. Some were still breathing when they were found. Others died in the arms of their companions, their bodies stiffening little by little. There were soldiers who begged to be killed. Others were asking only for water. Some called for their mothers, even though they were grown men. And the next day, it all started again. The Germans were also suffering. Constant bombardments, incessant attacks, daily casualties, but their positions were strong. They fought defensively, protected by deep trenches, well-calculated firing ranges, and experienced officers. Each Soviet attack failed, and each failure made the next attack even more difficult. The battlefield was beginning to change shape. There was no more clear ground. Only craters, debris, broken weapons and frozen bodies piled one on top of the other. Some soldiers advanced, passing through the same place where they had fought weeks before, recognizing fallen comrades by the number on their helmets or by a familiar scarf. Rzhev was no longer just a strategic point. She was becoming a cemetery without crosses. And the scariest part, nobody was talking about stopping. The Soviet command believed that victory was always one more attack away. But in reality, each offensive only fueled what the soldiers themselves began to call, in hushed tones, the meat grinder. And he was still far from finished. In Rzhev, it wasn't just the enemy that needed to be confronted. The ground, the weather, and the silence were also at war. When the ice began to break up during the day and froze again at night, the battlefield transformed into a living trap. The snow concealed deep craters, broken tree trunks, and the remains of destroyed houses. One wrong step could mean a fall, and often death. Soviet tanks advanced slowly, groaning under the weight of the steel. Some managed to fire once or twice before sinking into the treacherous ground. Tracks spun in vain, kicking up mud mixed with ice. Crews tried to escape, but they didn't always succeed. Many burned to death when the tank was hit. Others were trapped, listening to the metal creak as the cold took hold. The infantry suffered even more. Soldiers walked with ice-cold water in their boots for days on end. Their feet would go numb, then painful, then simply dead. Many had to have toes amputated. Others continued fighting without feeling their feet until they collapsed. The wounded suffered the most. A man who fell far from shelter had little chance of survival. Warm blood would flow out, freeze, and the body would rapidly lose heat. Within minutes, trembling would turn to rigidity. Within hours, life was extinguished. At night, the field seemed calm, but it was a deceptive calm. The wind swept through the corpses, raising fine snow that covered faces, outstretched arms, hands frozen in defensive gestures. By morning, some bodies were already partially buried, as if the earth itself were trying to hide them. For the soldiers, this was disturbing. To advance meant to trample over the dead, sometimes over friends, sometimes over enemies. There was no time to stop. There was no way to bury anyone. The battlefield advanced and retreated, but the bodies remained. The artillery continued relentlessly. Explosions lifted chunks of earth, wood, and flesh all at once. The impact caused snow to fall from the trees like a white rain mixed with shrapnel. Those who survived a bombardment rarely emerged unscathed, if not in body, then in mind. Communication was chaotic. Telephone cables froze or were severed by shrapnel. Messengers ran under fire, many never reaching their destination. Orders were lost. Units attacked without knowing that. Backup would not arrive. And yet the attacks continued. Each day, Rzhev became harder to recognize. Villages disappeared from the map. Forests turned into open fields of burnt stumps. Frozen rivers became makeshift roads until the ice broke and swallowed men and equipment. The feeling among the soldiers was clear. No one controlled that place anymore. It wasn't Germany. It wasn't the Soviet Union. It was Rzhev, a territory that seemed alive, hungry, drawing men in and never letting them back. A place where death didn't always come with a gunshot. Sometimes it came with the cold, with exhaustion, with a wrong step. And in the midst of this chaos, something even more dangerous was approaching. A new attempt at encirclement, a new promise of victory, and with it, thousands more men marching straight to the grinder. For the Soviet command, the answer seemed obvious. If attacking head-on was too costly, then it was necessary to cut Rzhev off from the rest of the German forces. Isolate the salient. Strangulate the enemy until they die of hunger, cold, and lack of ammunition. On the map, the plan was perfect. In reality, it was a nightmare. New offensives began from several points simultaneously. Units advanced through the forests, attempting to infiltrate via narrow paths, trails almost invisible beneath the snow. The idea was simple. Close the ring from behind, while others attacked from the front. But the Germans knew exactly what was happening. Each attempt at encirclement was met with swift and brutal counterattacks. German troops would appear out of nowhere, opening fire at point-blank range. Often, the Soviets believed they had broken through the enemy line, only to discover they had entered a trap, pocket prepared to kill them. The siege was drawing near, but it never closed. Soviet units advanced kilometers into enemy territory and suddenly realized they were alone. Contact with command disappeared. The artillery didn't arrive. The promised support never materialized. Then came the worst moment, the German flank attack. Grenades exploded in the middle of the columns. Machine guns appeared behind them, cutting off any attempt at retreat. Men ran in opposite directions, shouting contradictory orders. Many simply threw themselves to the ground, trying to disappear. Some Soviet pockets fought for days on end, surrounded, without food, without hot water, without hope. The wounded were left behind. Ammunition was rationed, shot by shot. When it ran out, all that remained were bayonets, shovels, bare hands. Few survived, and yet new orders were still being given. New attempts at encirclement were launched. The already devastated terrain became even more chaotic. Lines constantly shifted. A village captured in the morning could be back in German hands by night. Soldiers advanced through areas they believed to be safe and were killed by gunfire from positions that, on paper, no longer existed. Frustration was growing. Soviet officials knew something was wrong, but they couldn't stop. To stop meant to disobey, and disobeying in that war could be as deadly as an enemy bullet. On the German side, the situation was also worsening. The constant siege, even when failing, put pressure on the supply lines. Every road was bombed, every convoy was a risk, but as long as the ring wasn't completely closed, they would continue to resist. Rzhev was becoming a place where nobody really won. The Soviets attacked, partially surrounded the area, and were repelled. The Germans defended, counterattacked, survived, but they bled. And in the midst of all this, the soldiers, ordinary men, were beginning to understand something terrible. They weren't fighting for a quick victory. They were fighting for no die today. The net never closed, but death that was always complete. And while both sides sank into this frozen hell, Rzhev earned its definitive reputation, a place from which few would escape unscathed, even those who survived. For those on the German lines, Rzhev was not victory. It was not glory nor heroic conquest whispered in war songs. It was daily survival, a frozen purgatory where every breath was an act of rebellion against death that seeped into every pore. The men of the Wehrmacht once seen as invincible conquerors of Europe, now found themselves reduced to trembling shadows in a vast white desert, far too far from anything that resembled humanity. The roads, if they could be called that, were mere irregular furrows in the snow, traced by wheels that skidded and hooves of horses that stumbled. The supply convoys, those fragile threads of life, suffered constant attacks from Soviet partisans, ghosts of the forest that appeared out of nowhere, exploded wagons and disappeared like mist. Winter, that merciless tyrant, transformed each delivery into a precarious miracle. Ammunition arrived late, rusted by the ice. The food arrived frozen, hard as a rock, forcing the soldiers to break it open with rifle butts or melted over makeshift fires that barely warmed their hands. Sometimes nothing arrived, and the empty stomach echoed like a drum of despair, mingling with the howling of the wind. The soldiers dug ever deeper trenches, not only to protect themselves from enemy bullets and grenades, but to erect barriers against the murderous cold that devoured souls. The ground was hard as primordial stone, frozen in impenetrable layers that resisted any tool. Shovels broke with dry cracks like brittle bones, hoes bent under superhuman effort. Many men, driven mad by urgency, dug with their bare hands, nails scratching the icy crust until their fingers bled, torn flesh mingling with the red and white soil. The blood froze almost instantly, forming black scabs that broke with every movement, sending waves of excruciating pain through their arms. And yet they persisted, because to stop meant to freeze, meant to become part of the earth that swallowed them. The nights were the worst, an abyss of darkness where terror manifested itself in its purest form. The wind, an eternal lament of lost souls, pierced through worn coats, fabrics that once protected but now seemed mere illusions against the icy air that cut like blades. Snow seeped in from every corner, insinuating itself into boots, collars, helmets, a silent invader that stole warmth from the body drop by drop. Men slept sitting up, huddled together like cornered animals, embracing their cold weapons like mortal lovers, afraid to close their eyes and plunge into a sleep from which they would not awaken. The cold penetrated their bones, transforming dreams into waking nightmares of hypothermia, visions of distant mothers, of warm homes, of lives that seemed to belong to another world. Some simply did not wake up. In the morning, they were found stiff, frozen in grotesque postures, their faces tranquil, as if they had given up in their sleep, surrendering to the icy embrace of death that freed them from torment. Comrades dragged them outside, piling up bodies like firewood, with no time for mourning, only an empty gaze that echoed the growing emptiness in their souls. German positions were constantly bombarded, an incessant ordeal that tested the limits of sanity. Soviet artillery, those distant gods of thunder, never gave rest. Shells fell like merciless rain, shaking the trenches with impacts that reverberated in the chests of men. Explosions opened craters in the snow, burying soldiers alive under avalanches of earth and ice, suffocating them in a premature grave. Comrades dug desperately, bare hands tearing the soil, broken nails, lungs burning with the icy air, to pull them out from under the earth and snow. Sometimes they succeeded, pulling out coughing bodies, eyes wide with primal terror. Often not, and the muffled screams died slowly, leaving an accusing silence that haunted the survivors. The smell of cordite and burnt flesh hung in the air, mingling with the stench of decomposition preserved by the cold, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Entire units were isolated for days, even weeks, islands of despair in an endless white sea. Officers lost contact with higher command, radios failing under the ice or destroyed by shrapnel. Old orders were repeated like empty mantras because there were no new ones, only the echo of obsolete commands that sounded like death sentences. Each village, those smoldering ruins of wooden huts, became a small, enclosed world, a microcosm of horror where a handful of ragged men had to hold positions against seemingly endless attacks, human waves crashing against their defenses like inexorable tides. The solitude was crushing. No reinforcements, no news from the outside world, only the whisper of the wind and the distant roar of cannons, fueling paranoia of abandonment, that the Reich had forgotten them in that limbo. And the attacks came, inevitable as the dawn. The Red Army advanced in waves, even after suffering enormous losses that would have made any army retreat. For the Germans, this was terrifying, a spectacle of horror that defied reason. They saw men fall in heaps, bodies riddled with bullets falling onto the snow that turned red, and others continuing to advance over the bodies, trampling on friends and brothers as if they were mere steps. It wasn't blind courage, oh no. It was despair, driven by the relentless orders of commissars with pistols in hand, by fears of summary executions, by a war machine that devoured its own children without pity. The Germans from their trenches felt the terror growing. How to fight an enemy that did not value life, how to resist a horde that was reborn from the ashes of its dead. Hand-to-hand combat became commonplace, a primal chaos where civilization dissolved into bestial instincts. Grenades were thrown into trenches, exploding into shrapnel that tore through flesh and bone. Bayonets were wielded in the dark, cold blades penetrating warm bodies, the damp sound of piercing echoing in the night. Shouts in Russian and German mingled, muffled by the snow that fell like a shroud, a dissonant chorus of agony and fury. Sometimes silence would come suddenly, and it was even more disturbing. A void that suggested total annihilation, where survivors looked at each other with empty eyes, questioning whether they were still human or mere ghosts. The psychological toll was immense, a slow erosion of the mind that transformed warriors into empty shells. Soldiers wrote trembling letters, words blurred by frozen tears, speaking of a cursed place where time seemed frozen in an eternal cycle of suffering. Some murmured that Rzhev ate men, devouring them piece by piece, soul by soul. Others, in hoarse whispers, said it was worse than Stalingrad because there were no grand ruins to give scale to the tragedy, only silent forests, bare trees like mute sentinels, and a constant invisible death that seeped in like fog. Dreams were haunted by visions of frozen comrades, of endless attacks, of an infinite whiteness that swallowed everything. Fear turned to despair, despair turned to terror. Terror that it would never end, that Rzhev was hell on earth, a divine punishment for the nation's sins. Even so, they resisted, because retreating meant opening the way to Moscow, the jewel of the empire that Hitler coveted, because every meter defended, there spared other places, diverting Soviet fury to that cursed salient. Because the order was clear, engraved in iron. Rzhev could not fall under penalty of court-martial and eternal shame. But the truth was simple and cruel. Each additional day in Rzhev cost lives that would never be replaced. Young people torn from German farms and towns, thrown into that meat grinder. The salient remained standing, a stubborn protrusion on the map, but inside it rotted, corroded by ice, blood, and madness. And while Germans and Soviets killed each other in this white hell, something slowly approached. A new phase of the battle, broader, more ambitious, and even bloodier. A spectre hovering on the horizon, promising more pain, more loss, more darkness. As the snow began to melt, a whisper of hope swept through the trenches, like a warm wind promising redemption. Many soldiers believed the worst was over, that the yoke of winter was finally loosening. The extreme cold reluctantly eased, allowing fingers, once stiff as dry branches, to move again with painful sensitivity. Weapons stopped jamming so frequently, the metal warming in the timid spring sun. For the first time in months, some could smell damp earth, an aroma of life reborn, instead of the eternal stench of gunpowder, ice, and decay. It was as if Rzhev, That sleeping monster blinked and revealed a less cruel face, inviting illusions of relief. But Rzhev merely changed his face, a treacherous metamorphosis that replaced the icy white with a viscous brown of torment. Where before there had been hard snow, compact as armor, now there was deep mud, a thick, sticky substance that sucked at boots like a hungry predator, swallowing truck wheels and tank tracks with an obscene sucking sound. Walking became exhausting, each step a battle against the earth clinging to feet, turning marches into painful drags. Running was almost impossible, a ridiculous fantasy in a field where the treacherous ground transformed heroes into slow prey, vulnerable to enemy fire. Every movement required titanic effort, and time in war is life, a precious commodity that slipped through one's fingers like mud itself. The Soviet command, thirsting for revenge after the relentless winter, saw in the summer a gleaming new opportunity. Without winter as an insurmountable obstacle, it was believed that the weakened and exhausted Wehrmacht would finally succumb to the weight of a renewed assault. New attacks were planned with feverish optimism, maps drawn in heated rooms, strategies debated by generals who would never feel the mud on their knees. More men were sent, hordes of fresh recruits plucked from distant villages, eyes filled with propaganda and fear. More tanks, those steel colossi roaring promises of power. More cannons, voracious mouths ready to spit fire. More promises that now it will work. Empty echoes masking the underlying terror of yet another failure. But the Germans were still there, rooted like ancient trees in the devastated landscape. They used the time gained in winter, those months of frozen agony, to reinforce positions with fierce determination, rearrange lines into labyrinths of death, prepare even more deadly firing ranges where every angle was calculated to maximize the carnage. Every likely road of advance was marked with treacherous mines, traps that would explode under unwary feet. Every village, those clusters of rubble, transformed once again into an impregnable fortress, with machine guns nestled in bullet-riddled windows, cannons hidden in collapsed barns. The defense was a spiderweb, patient and lethal, waiting for prey that would struggle in vain. When the summer offensive began, Soviet artillery opened fire with full force, a cataclysm that shook the foundations of the earth. The ground trembled as if the world were breaking apart. Houses collapsed in clouds of dust and debris. Trees exploded into sharp splinters that flew like deadly arrows. For a few moments it seemed impossible that anyone could survive that infernal bombardment, a deluge of iron and fire that turned day into night of smoke. The air vibrated with the constant roar, the smell of sulfur and burnt earth choking the lungs, instilling a primal terror in the hearts of those who took shelter. Then the infantry advanced, a human tide of brown uniforms against the unstable green of summer, and the same scene repeated itself, a cycle of horror unfolding like a recurring nightmare. German machine guns, those tireless reapers, opened fire from well-hidden positions, wasp nests, spitting bullets in endless bursts, cutting through entire ranks like scythes through ripe wheat. Anti-tank guns, watchful eyes on the landscape, destroyed Soviet armor before they could support the foot soldiers, turning tanks into blazing pyres that illuminated the field at dusk, with crews screaming as they tried to escape under heavy fire, flames licking their skin, the air filling with screams that echoed like curses. The mud made everything worse, a treacherous ally conspiring against the attackers. The wounded couldn't crawl to safety, sinking into the mud that bound them like shackles, turning groans into muffled pleas as bullets found them motionless. Men fell and remained trapped, unable to move fast enough to escape the merciless fire, the ground swallowing them alive in a viscous embrace. Vehicles bogged down and became easy targets, wheels spinning in vain as shells pulverized them, twisted metal mingling with flesh. The battlefield filled with destroyed machines, twisted, Hulls smoking and bodies covered in mud and blood, a grotesque tapestry of defeat where red merged with brown in chaotic patterns. The advance was slow, painfully slow. Each meter gained a Pyrrhic victory watered with rivers of blood. Each village conquered cost hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives, soldiers falling in piles that blocked streets, glazed eyes fixed on the indifferent sky. And even then, many were lost again days later, German counterattacks sweeping away gains like gales, leaving the Soviets retreating over their own dead. The front line seemed to breathe, advancing in agonizing spasms, retreating in chaotic withdrawals, advancing again, always leaving more dead in its wake, a trail of rotting bodies under the sun, attracting swarms of flies that buzzed like choruses of demons. For the soldiers, the sensation was suffocating, a crushing weight on their chests that stole their breath. They fought in the oppressive heat, covered in mud that dried into hard crusts, itching their skin like plagues. Voracious mosquitoes bit incessantly, spreading fevers that weakened already exhausted bodies. Hunger gnawed at their insides, meager rations divided into tiny portions. Extreme fatigue clouded their minds, turning days into fogs of delirium. There was no real rest, only naps interrupted by attack alarms. There was no clear victory, only the continuation of something that seemed endless, an eternal mill that ground hopes into dust. Terror set in, terror that each day would be the same. That death would come not in glory, but in a puddle of mud. Despair that their sacrifices were in vain, thrown into a bottomless abyss. The Germans were also on the brink, a taut thread about to snap. They suffered from constant bombardments that rattled already fragile nerves. Incessant attacks that tested depleted reserves, continuous losses that left units like skeletons of their former selves. Men trembled in waterlogged trenches, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, questioning the meaning of it all. But once again, Rzhev resisted, not through strategic genius, but through sheer defensive stubbornness, a resilience born of the fear of retreat and the absurd cost the enemy had to pay to advance, piles of bodies that served as walls. As summer began to end, with leaves tinged with autumn, it became clear to both sides. The offensive had failed, a mirage dissipated in a vapor of blood. Rzhev remained standing, stubborn and unwavering, a salient that mocked Soviet efforts. And the death toll had risen alarmingly, a census of horrors that counted not only bodies, but broken souls. The hope of a swift victory vanished forever, evaporating like dew in the sun. In its place arose something darker, the understanding that this battle would not be won with a decisive blow, but with utter attrition, a slow erosion that would consume entire nations. And as autumn approached, bringing back the biting cold like an old enemy, the Soviet High Command prepared something even bigger, a huge gamble, a colossal plan that would mobilize incalculable resources, an offensive that promised to change everything, to sweep away the salient like a storm. It would have a name, echoing in the annals of history as a synonym for carnage. And it would be marked as one of the bloodiest moments in the entire history of Rzhev, a chapter where terror would reach its peak, despair would become law, and hell would reveal itself in all its merciless glory. In Rzhev, time ceased to make sense, dissolving into a grey vortex where past, present and future merged into an indistinct mass of eternal suffering. Days mingled like fog over snowy fields. Weeks passed without the soldiers knowing exactly when they had begun, lost in a calendar torn apart by war that respected neither hours nor seasons. War became routine, and that was perhaps the most terrifying part, a perverse normality that transformed horror into habit, chaos into daily life, corroding the human essence until only an empty mechanical shell remained, driven by primitive instincts. There were no more dawns full of promise, only abrupt awakenings to yet another cycle of pain, where the rising sun illuminated not hope, but the remnants of past battles. Smoking craters, twisted bodies, a carpet of desolation stretching to the horizon. The men were exhausted, not just physically, but with a profound exhaustion that penetrated their bones, minds, and souls. Soviet soldiers, those sons of vast Mother Russia, slept in shallow holes, hastily dug with blunt shovels and trembling hands, often filled with icy water that seeped in like a slow poison, turning rest into torture. They awoke with aching bodies, every muscle protesting against the weight of accumulated fatigue, their damp clothes clinging to their skin like a second layer of misery, hardened by mud, dried sweat, and coagulated blood that painted grotesque patterns on once immaculate uniforms. Beards grew stiff, tangled with earth, and fragments of ice, faces prematurely aged by months of deprivation, eyes sunken like wells of darkness where the light of youth had been extinguished. They ate what they could find, miserable morsels of stale bread that crunched between decayed teeth, or roots unearthed from the frozen earth, or worse still, nothing, empty stomachs that roared like hungry beasts, weakening bodies already on the verge of collapse. Even so, when the order came, echoing like an invisible whip from the implacable commissioners, they rose and advanced, feet dragging in the snow that betrayed them at every step, bodies propelled by a grim inertia. Not because they believed in some grand cause, in slogans of proletarian glory, or in defending the fatherland against the fascist invader. Those illusions had dissipated like smoke from extinguished bonfires. But because there was no alternative, a terrifying void where disobedience meant summary execution, a bullet in the back of the neck under the cold gaze of comrades who tomorrow could be next. Many no longer asked why they were there, why their bodies were hurled against walls of fire and steel. The questions had been silenced by the constant roar of artillery, by the groans of the wounded, by the indifference of the grey sky. They simply obeyed, like broken automatons in a death factory, marching in irregular lines over minefields, attacking fortified positions with rusty bayonets, surviving, or not, falling like dry leaves in an eternal autumn. Piled up bodies serving as shields for those who came behind. Officers, those men hardened by hierarchy, noticed that some soldiers simply stared ahead, blankly, as if their souls had been left somewhere in the forest weeks before, abandoned in a deserted trench, in a burned-out village, in a dream of peace that would never return. Those empty gazes were windows to the abyss, reflecting a silent terror, the terror that their humanity had been ripped away, leaving only walking hulls. On the German side, the attrition was the same. A distorted mirror of Soviet suffering, where Teutonic efficiency dissolved into a universal fatigue that respected neither uniforms nor ideologies. Defending positions for months on end, these lines drawn on the map like open wounds, corroded any notion of normality, transforming days into an endless sequence of vigil and dread. The constant fear of a night attack, Russian shadows emerging from the darkness like summoned demons, the sound of artillery that never ceased, an incessant hammering that echoed in skulls like a funeral bell, the daily sight of dead or mutilated comrades, legs torn off by mines, faces disfigured by shrapnel, groans that lingered into the night like curses. All this broke strong men, once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht, reducing them to uncontrollable tremors, to whispers of forgotten prayers. Some soldiers began to make simple, fatal mistakes, a careless reloading of a weapon, a moment of hesitation upon sighting the enemy, errors that in normal times would be laughable, but that cost lives, dragging more souls into the vortex. Others reacted too late, minds clouded by exhaustion, allowing grenades to roll into shelters before they could be thrown back. There were cases of men who simply refused to leave the trenches, not out of declared cowardice, but because they could no longer, bodies paralyzed by a weariness that transcended the physical, a numbness of will that anchored them to the ground like deep roots, War also entered dreams, infiltrating the only possible refuge, transforming sleep into an even crueler battlefield. Men awoke screaming, bodies convulsing in spasms of nocturnal terror, reliving attacks that haunted them, the hiss of bullets, the impact of explosions, the smell of burning flesh. Others slept sitting up, leaning against damp earthen walls, their eyes open like dead sentinels, minds wandering in a limbo between wakefulness and delirium. Some spoke to themselves, hoarse, voices repeating ancient orders like maddened mantras. Vorwärts, attack, echoes of commands that had lost their meaning, or calling out the names of people thousands of kilometers away, mothers, wives, children whose faces faded from memory or were already dead, ghosts that haunted the subconscious with silent accusations. Sleep, once restorative, became a torment, a labyrinth of nightmares where Rzhev stretched endlessly, forests that swallowed entire battalions, snows that buried the living, a cycle of horror that allowed no escape. The worst part was the feeling of futility, a corrosive despair that seeped in like a slow poison, poisoning every effort, every sacrifice. Villages filled with blood, streets paved with the bodies of comrades, were abandoned days later in tactical retreats that seemed like betrayals, leaving the survivors questioning the purpose of so much pain. Forests conquered at the cost of torn limbs, of lost friends, were once again contested in counterattacks that repeated the carnage, as if the terrain were cursed, refusing to be dominated. Soldiers returned to positions where they had fought before, recognizing marks on the terrain as macabre old acquaintances. Ancient craters filled with stagnant water, tree trunks riddled with bullets, frozen bodies that were still there, preserved by the ice like relics of past battles, familiar faces frozen in expressions of eternal agony. It was like fighting within a vicious circle, a hellish loop where advances were illusory, victories ephemeral, and death the only constant, fostering a profound terror. The terror that everything was in vain, that their lives were coins spent on a lost gamble. Many began to understand something terrible, a revelation that echoed like an evil whisper in the cold wind. Rzhev was not a battle meant to be won quickly, with a stroke of strategic genius or a heroic charge. It was a battle meant to wear men down until no one was left whole, a meat grinder that consumed generations, grinding bodies and spirits into an indistinct paste of suffering. The wounded dragged themselves back to the lines, limbs amputated without anesthesia, excruciating pain that made them beg for death. The survivors carried invisible scars, fractured minds that would never heal, visions of horror that would haunt them for lifetimes if they survived to tell the tale. Yet, the High Command, those distant gods in heated bunkers, demanded results, cold reports rising up the chain of command like offerings to a merciless altar. Statistics replaced names, turning Ivan Petrovich into an anonymous number, Hans Müller into a calculated loss. Losses became numbers on spreadsheets, cold and impersonal, that didn't scream in pain, didn't bleed on snowy fields, didn't freeze in eternal nights. But the soldiers did, their bodies trembling in the cold, their voices echoing in muffled groans, their souls dissolving in an ocean of despair. And while broken men continued, fighting out of sheer force of habit, inertia that propelled them like puppets whose strings were pulled by instinctive survival instinct, something grand was taking shape far away, in map rooms illuminated by electric lamps, where generals traced lines with unwavering pens. A huge plan, a colossal strategy that would mobilize entire divisions, tanks roaring like awakened beasts, artillery that would make the earth tremble, an offensive that promised finally to destroy the German salient once and for all, to sweep away the enemy like an irresistible avalanche. For many, it would be the last hope, a glimpse of an end to the torment, a chance to return to distant homes, to normal lives that seemed like faded dreams. For others, just another death sentence, A final chapter in a saga of horror, where blood would flow in wider rivers, screams would multiply, and despair would reach its zenith. It would receive a powerful name, echoing in the annals of history like distant thunder, and would go down in history as a daring gamble that would end in absolute carnage, a feast for death that would devour thousands more, leaving Rzhev as an eternal monument to human weariness, to unspeakable terror, to the despair that swallows worlds. While the whole world watched Stalingrad, believing it to be the epicenter of the war, Stalin was preparing another move. Away from the headlines, away from the glory, he wanted to finally put an end to the ghost of Rzhev. The plan was given a powerful name, Operation Mars. The idea was simple on paper and gigantic in execution. A massive, simultaneous attack coming from multiple sides with the ultimate goal of surround and destroy completely the German salient. Not just pushing the enemy back, but crushing them until nothing is left. To achieve this, the Red Army assembled enormous forces, fresh troops, new tanks, heavy artillery. Men were hastily deployed. Many didn't know exactly where they were going. They only heard that this would be the decisive blow. Winter had returned. The snow covered the battlefield once more, hiding the old bodies beneath a new white layer. To those arriving now, it seemed like a clean field. To those who had been there for months, it was just a cemetery in disguise. When Operation Mars began, the sky exploded. Soviet artillery fired like never before. The ground shook. Entire forests were torn apart. Villages vanished in seconds. The noise was so intense that many soldiers were temporarily deafened even before entering combat. Then came the infantry, and behind her, the tanks. But the Germans were waiting. They knew this attack would be different. They had reinforced positions, adjusted firing ranges, prepared deep defenses. When the Soviets advanced, they were met by a wall of fire. Tanks were hit and exploded, lighting up the snow with orange flames. Crews tried to escape in flames, running only a few meters before collapsing. Infantry was cut down by hidden machine guns, which only revealed their position after killing dozens. Even so, the attacks continued. Soviet units repeatedly advanced, even after being nearly destroyed. Officers fell in front of the troops. Sergeants took over. When they died, ordinary soldiers tried to lead, advancing purely on instinct. The siege seemed possible. For a brief moment, some believed the ring was almost closed. But then came the German counterattacks. Swift, violent, precise. German forces attacked the flanks, isolating Soviet units that had advanced too far. Entire pockets were surrounded. Inside them, the fighting turned into pure despair. Men fought until they ran out of ammunition. Then they used bayonets, then shovels, then nothing. The snow was black with gunpowder and blood. Operation Mars continued for weeks. Each day cost thousands of lives. Every small advance was paid for with an absurd price. And slowly the truth became impossible to hide. Mars was failing, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. As Stalingrad drew closer to Soviet victory, Rzhev devoured men in silence. There was no celebration there, only continuous, cold, anonymous death. Stalin's great gamble was turning into something worse than a failure. It was turning into a massacre the world would barely see, and the meat grinder, now at full speed, still hadn't finished its work. After the first few days of Operation Mars, there was no longer any doubt among the soldiers on the front lines. Something had gone very wrong, but the offensive did not stop. On the contrary, it intensified. New orders arrived demanding immediate progress. New units were being pushed forward, and the battlefield could not hold any more dead bodies. Soviet divisions entered combat already reduced in numbers. Some lost half their men in a few hours. Others were nearly destroyed in a single unsuccessful attack. Still, they kept advancing, because retreating was not a real option. The tanks tried to fight their way through, but were hunted down one by one. German anti-tank guns fired with deadly accuracy. One sharp hit, one explosion, and the armored vehicle became a smoking steel coffin. At night, the field was illuminated by constant fires, as if the ground itself were burning. The infantry suffered the worst. Men advanced, knowing they probably wouldn't return. Some wrote quick letters before the attack. Others left personal belongings with comrades, as if saying goodbye. Many simply walked in silence, their gaze fixed. Ahead, already accepting their fate. When the attacks failed, and they almost always did, the survivors were trapped in open terrain under continuous fire. The wounded cried out for help. Officers tried to reorganize the chaos. Sometimes they succeeded. More often, they were killed in the process. Surrounded Soviet pockets were crushed one by one. Inside, the fight became something primal. No communication, no supplies, no hope of rescue. Ammunition ran out quickly. Food disappeared. The water froze. All that remained was to resist until the end. Some tried to break through the encirclement at night. Few succeeded. Most were shot down in the dark, lying in the snow without anyone knowing their names. The Germans also paid a high price. The counter-offensives were costly for experienced men, difficult to replace. Veteran officers fell, leading desperate attacks to close gaps. Entire units were reduced to shadows of what they had been months before. But even so, the line held. Rzhev did not fall. After weeks of fighting, the countryside seemed unrecognizable. There were no more intact villages. The forests were black skeletons. The snow was perpetually dirty. The smell of gunpowder and decay hung in the air, even in the intense cold. It was at this moment that the name began to circulate among the soldiers. First in whispers, then openly. The meat grinder of Rzhev. It wasn't an exaggerated metaphor. It was an accurate description. Men entered. Men were being crushed. And the land remained the same. When Operation Mars finally lost momentum, there was no official announcement of failure, only silence. A heavy silence built upon piles of frozen bodies and reports that would never be read aloud. Rzhev continued there, untouched, insatiable, and ironically, the end of that hell would not come from a great victory in battle, but from a cold decision made far away. In early 1943, the tone of the war changed. The news circulating around the world spoke of Stalingrad, the city in ruins, the German siege broken, the surrender of an entire Wehrmacht army. For the first time, it seemed clear Germany could be defeated. But while the world celebrated, Rzhev was still bleeding. Operation Mars had failed, but this was not openly stated. There were no speeches. There was no acknowledgement of losses. Official reports spoke of intense fighting and limited gains. The words were cold, clean, very different from the muddy and bloody reality of the front line. For Stalin, Stalingrad was the victory that needed to be displayed. Rzhev was a mistake that needed to be forgotten. Soviet troops around the salient noticed something strange. The attacks decreased. The orders became less aggressive. Large offensives gave way to smaller, almost automatic skirmishes. The war there hadn't ended. It had merely lost importance. But for those who were struggling, this brought no relief. Soldiers continued to die in patrols, skirmishes, and random bombardments. Artillery still fell. Snipers still hunted. Mines still exploded under weary footsteps. The difference is that now all of this was happening without any promise of imminent victory. On the German side, the situation was also changing. With the defeat at Stalingrad, the German High Command began to rethink its priorities. The Rzhev Salient, once seen as a direct threat to Moscow, now seemed too expensive a luxury. Keeping thousands of men trapped there, slowly bleeding out, no longer made strategic sense. The German soldiers noticed it first through the details. Fewer reinforcements, less ammunition, more defensive orders, a different tone from the officers. Something was being prepared. Meanwhile, the battlefield remained as always, destroyed, silent, covered in human remains. Soviet soldiers walked through areas where they had fought months before and still found bodies, some frozen, others partially buried, all forgotten. Rzhev was beginning to disappear from conversations, newspapers, and speeches. But it didn't disappear from reality. It remained there like an open wound that no one wanted to look at. A place where war brought neither glory nor clear progress, only pure wear and tear. And then, almost without warning, came the decision that would end that chapter as coldly as it had begun. It would not be a defeat in battle. It wouldn't be a bloody victory. It would be a silent withdrawal. Winter still dominated the landscape when the decision was made. Far from the mud, far from the snow, and far from the dead, the German High Command concluded the obvious. Rzhev was no longer worth the price paid for her. The salient, once seen as a spearhead aimed at Moscow, had become a dead weight. Maintaining those positions cost experienced men precious ammunition and time, all things Germany could no longer afford to waste after Stalingrad. The order came clear, cold, and definitive: withdraw. But it wasn't an escape. The Germans would plan every step. The retreat had to be organized, clean, calculated, no panic, no rush, just discipline, even after so much suffering. At night, in almost complete silence, the troops began to move. Heavy artillery was withdrawn first, then vehicles, then men. Destroyed roads were used one last time. Bridges were mined. Depots were burned. Already dead villages were razed again, leaving nothing useful behind. The soldiers walked without looking back. Many felt relief, others emptiness. Some knew they were alive only by luck. Others carried in their eyes everything they had seen and knew that it would never leave them. By the time the Red Army realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. The Soviet patrols advanced cautiously, expecting ambushes that never came. The silence was eerie. There were no shots fired, no counterattacks, only abandoned positions, empty trenches, broken weapons, and frozen corpses left behind. Rzhev had been abandoned. No final battle, no surrender, no clear victory. When the Soviets finally entered the region, they found a scene that seemed otherworldly: non-existent villages, mutilated forests, fields covered with human remains, scattered in every direction. In many places, the ground was so saturated with death that it was impossible to distinguish where one offensive ended and another began. It was difficult to call that a victory. Yes, the enemy had gone away, but the price was written in the earth. Rzhev's liberation was not celebrated. It was occupied in silence. And, in that heavy silence, as the wind passed through ruins and makeshift crosses, it was clear to any soldier who was there: no one had truly won. The battle was over. But horror was still everywhere. And what would come next would no longer be combat. It would be confrontation with what remained. When the last shots ceased, Rzhev no longer looked like a newly liberated place. It seemed like a world that had been abandoned by life. The Red Army soldiers advanced cautiously, step by step, as if the ground could still attack them. In many places they weren't walking at all. They trampled on the very history of the battle. Beneath the melting snow, bodies emerged. Some recent, others had been there for months, preserved by the cold like frozen memories of hell. There were men sitting, leaning against trees, as if they were simply resting. Others lay in strange positions, arms raised, mouths open, eyes empty. Many had never been identified. They had no names. They had no graves. The trenches were littered with human remains, broken equipment, empty cartridges, and pieces of clothing stiffened by the ice. In some shelters, soldiers had died in their sleep. In others, they had fought to the very last second. Everything was there, mixed together without order. The villages simply no longer existed. Where houses once stood, there were only ashes, lonely chimneys, and holes in the ground. Churches were ruins, schools were craters. In many places, nothing remained to indicate that people had ever lived there. The smell was impossible to ignore. Even in the cold, the air carried gunpowder, old smoke, and decay. Soldiers covered their noses, not only because of the smell, but to try to ward off the feeling that they were walking through an endless cemetery. Teams began collecting the dead, but they were so many that in some areas it simply wasn't possible to bury them all. Mass graves appeared, makeshift intersections, helmets stuck in wooden stakes marked where someone had fallen. Some soldiers recognized comrades who had disappeared months before. A scarf, a watch, a piece of uniform. Sometimes nothing more than the shape of a body. There was no celebration. There were no speeches. The victory, if it could even be called that, was too heavy a burden to celebrate. Rzhev offered no glory. It only offered conscience, awareness of the true cost of war, awareness of how many lives had been spent for a few kilometers of land, the awareness that that place would never again be just a point on the map. And as the soldiers walked away, leaving behind makeshift crosses and memories impossible to erase, it became clear that the true impact of the Rzhev Meat Grinder wasn't just in what had happened there, but in what she would represent forever. And that brings us to the final chapter, not the end of the battle, but the legacy of carnage. Rzhev did not go down in history as a great victory. It also wasn't marked as a clear defeat. It became something much heavier, a warning written in blood. When the numbers began to be understood, the shock was silent. Between the dead, wounded and missing, hundreds of thousands of men had been consumed in that frozen protrusion. Some estimates suggest that more than 1 million combined casualties, a price so high that for a long time nobody wanted to talk about it openly. For the soldiers who survived, Rzhev never truly ended. They carried that battle home with them, in their dreams, in their silences, in the eyes that avoided speaking about that place. Many veterans said that Rzhev was worse than other more famous battles because there was no decisive moment there, just continuous death, day after day. For the Soviet Union, Rzhev became a cruel lesson. Victory on the Eastern Front would indeed be achieved, but at the cost of almost unimaginable suffering. The meat grinder showed that the enemy could be worn down, but also that the Red Army itself would pay a terrible price for it. For Germany, Rzhev was the beginning of the end of the offensive illusion in the East, a place where experienced men were lost without return, defending a position that, in the end, had to be abandoned. And what about history? Rzhev remained for decades a forgotten battle. No big films, no famous speeches, no images of spectacular surrender, only fragmented accounts, letters, bones found in the ground many years later. Even today, farmers in the region still find helmets, cartridges, and human remains when ploughing the land. The war never completely left that place. It just sank into the ground. Rzhev Meat Grinder wasn't about individual heroes or ingenious maneuvers. It was about human resilience pushed to the limit, on how much a man can endure before he breaks, regarding the real cost of holding a line on the map. And above all, it was a brutal reminder that, in war, not every battle has winners. Some only. They consume everything. It is Rzhev. Rzhev consumed an entire generation.